Welcome to Native Bidaské, Native News Online's weekly spotlight on the people making news and leading change in Indian country.
Welcome to another episode of Native Bidaské. I'm Levi Rickert, your host, and we're going to talk about a subject today that actually needs to be talked about in Indian country, and that's about blood quantum. Across Indian country, many tribal nations are facing the prospect of declining membership that is caused by blood quantum requirements. With dwindling tribal members, the subject of blood quantum is a topic that many tribes in Indian country are now confronting. In a newly released book in April, Beyond Blood Quantum, Refusal to Disappear, Norbert S. Hill and Megan Hill edited the essays on the subject. Mr. Hill is with us today. He's the former area director of education training for the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. Megan is a senior director of the Project on Indigenous Governance and Development and the director of Honoring Nations program at Harvard University. They are special guests today on Native Bidaské. Welcome to both of you. How are you today?
Thank you. Yeah.
Great. Thanks for having us.
Yes. First, let's discuss what is blood quantum for those who may be non-native, have no idea what we're talking about. What is it, and who wants to go first?
Norbert, why don't you start us off?
Okay. Well, 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago, I interviewed for a job at a university, and one of the questions a faculty member asked me was, "Why are you an Indian?" And I looked at him. I said, "Well, it came with the body. Why?" What I didn't know is that was the seed for the book 50 years later. That identity is a process, not an event, in that we all go through. And I didn't know those learning issues came up in terms of how we identify ourselves. And I noticed that in our enrollments in the Oneida tribe is that we have more quarter bloods being enrolled, and our mortality rate is becoming higher. So the problem is that we're losing population, so we may terminate ourselves if we're not careful. So we have an opportunity to reinvent ourselves.
And quite frankly, this generation just are not having the number of children that may be like my parents. I come from a family of 7, and that's kind of almost unheard of these days. And Megan, what's your comments on blood quantum? Why is it so important?
Yeah, I mean, blood quantum, my understanding is that its first use was really in the 1800s and was a way the military used to categorize people, and sort of with the introduction of the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934, blood quantum really became a legal way that was codified into the way that the U.S. government identified who was and who wasn't Native. And so through the IRA, the Indian Reorganization Act, one has to prove that they are 1/4 Indian blood. And it really became an economic tool to decide who got resources, who didn't get resources. And also at its core, you hear this term a lot, mathematical genocide. The idea being that over time, Indians would marry out in such a capacity that eventually there wouldn't be any Indians left. So there would be no need for any federal trust responsibilities. And ultimately, the land also would be at risk. And so it's a policy and a process that also has been incorporated into the constitutions of tribal governments across the country. My dad, Norbert, has the number, but I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 70% of all tribes use blood quantum as the means by which they identify who is and who isn't a citizen of their nation. So it's a huge issue, it's an important issue, and it's probably one of the most critical issues that Indian country faces.
Yeah, well, you are right. We don't have families of 10 and 12 anymore. We have families of 1 and 2. It's an economic issue. And so baby boomers are dying, and fewer people are there to replace them. So if you look at the demographics, you don't have to be a math major to figure out that blood quantum is not sustainable over time. Senator Higgins in 1895 in Delaware said intermarriage is the solution to the Indian problem, that Indians will just fade away. They'll lose their language, they'll lose their ceremonies, they'll lose their culture, and they'll take their rightful place in white society. So they knew it a long time ago that this would terminate us.
Yes, and you just mentioned something as Megan was talking, that term Indian problem, and Megan, why don't you define that? Because I think I kind of define it as they never known what to do with us. So go ahead.
I think that's probably the right definition, right? They didn't know what to do with us, and we went from the Department of War to the Department of Interior, and it's a economic equation. Phil Deloria, in his foreword of the Beyond Blood Quantum book, talks about it being blood quantum, this idea of sort of using percentages or to identify who is and who isn't Indian. It really sort of an extended expression of colonialism, and one that we've incorporated as our own, sort of like I'll get in trouble for this one, but that fry bread's a traditional food. It's not.
Yeah. It's very true. And I'll tell you this, that I read the book over the Memorial Day weekend, and it was, not to use old cliche, but I'll use it, life-changing. I mean, I honestly was a strong believer, defender, I guess, if you can say it that way, of blood quantum. After reading the book, I'm not so sure anymore. And so I guess, and I'll say this, I'm glad that you're on, because I still need to formulate, and I'll write about it someday, of how I've changed. And I just think that, I guess I knew it, but it didn't really ever sink in. But it was real. One of the premise of your book was that 1934 Indian Reorganization Act that you referred to, and how has that hurt tribes? Why is it burdensome to us right now?
Well, so in 1936 we were in the Great Depression, and it was, some Indians called it the New Deal, and other Indians called it the Raw Deal. There were some benefits to that because we were able to recover some land. We got some grants. We got some money, and again, it was the Depression. Everybody was in bad straits. This is 1934. 1936, we adopted the Constitution, which was written by government lawyers, and it included the provision of blood quantum in the constitutions in terms of our own identity, so they could figure out how to give out resources. And so, as a result, the Indian chiefs in our community married the girl next door, and they were full-bloods. Mm-hmm. So here we are 2.5 generations later, because Indians marry out more than any other ethnic group, and that's across the country. And we've because there was not any economic development much on Indian land, that they moved away to other places, and so we've got a lot of people that don't reside on the reservation any longer.
Yeah. And I think sort of an additional piece to how it hurts tribe, there's sort of an external and an internal divisions that it creates. Sort of externally, right? The less Indians you have, the less, there is a responsibility to those citizens or that nation. But internally, it creates sort of this internal system of have and have-nots, and internal divisions of who gets to vote or who doesn't. And it really takes relationships away from kin, and does create, I know we've said it a couple times, but this economic analysis of how you're related to each other, rather than who in your heart or in your family you're related to. And I think it turns into this breakdown of community.
So the conversation now is not about blood. We learned a lot since 2017. It's about identity and belonging. Mm-hmm. And if we can shift the conversation to identity and belonging, we can make informed decisions.
So with that identity and belonging, it really speaks to community, doesn't it?
Yes, yeah. Yes, it does.
Yeah. I guess I've been contemplating that as well since I read the book. It's like, and how many essays are in that book? I read it. I should have counted them, but
I think there's 17.
17?
There's 24 authors. A couple of them are generational. So we have a couple that are a mother and a daughter writing together. But 24 authors, I think 17 or 18 chapters, a number of poems incorporated. So it's this sort of multi-generational, multi-tribal conversation on what it means to be a citizen of a nation, and beyond that, what does it mean to belong?
Quite frankly, is a lot of tribes are so concerned about the membership, and I know here in Michigan, I know that tribes are talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
Is it too late for some tribes? Is there one tribe you can cite that maybe, hey, they should have dealt with this years ago, or do people still have time to rectify it?
Well, I think there are probably a number of tribes that are extinct. I don't, each tribe has to make the decision of how to enroll their own citizens. And some of them will make poor decisions and others won't. And we need to learn from each other and talk about how do we survive not the next 20 years, but the next 200 years. The problem right now is benefits are pitted against sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
Benefits are short term and sovereignty is forever. And so we got to figure out how to talk about sovereignty instead of are we members of a club that get benefits, or are we citizens of a nation that have responsibilities? So we need to talk about responsibilities. So I think that's where it lies. The smaller tribes are going to have more difficulty than the larger tribes, I think. But everybody's going to make a different decision, and we need to learn from each other and what works and what doesn't work.
And will it require a constitution change in tribes? Yeah. I'm assuming it does.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, just sort of on that, right? So we have a chapter by Jill Dorfler on there who, as many tribes are sort of grappling with this issue, she sort of posits, what if we think about our fellow relatives as people that make contributions rather than drain resources, right? And so sort of turning on this.
I like that. I remember that part. Yes. Yeah. I remember that part, but go on.
It's just a different way of thinking about it. And I think it really speaks to the strength of community when you think of each other and your relatives as assets and kin, rather than sort of people that are taking too much or whatever the conversation is. And so I think we need to evolve the conversation in many ways beyond what Norbert just said about benefits.
So you could have. I feel sorry for the poor kid in Oklahoma who's 1/8 of 8 different tribes, and he's a full blood, but doesn't belong to anybody. But I mean that can be true with a lot of multi-tribal identities, and so we need to figure that out.
Yeah. That makes it's such a complex issue. There's an essay in the book that deals with the pretendians, those who pretend to be Native Americans. But they have been proven to be frauds, right? Fraudulent folks, and we could name names, and I'm not going to at this point. But how should these pretendians play into the discussion of how tribes move forward? Because that's where I'm still needing to formulate my.
Well, I don't think they have a role, right? I mean, if you look at the chapter starts out identifying pretendianism as a problem, but it really sort of pivots to what is an ally and what can non-natives do to support tribal nations or tribal citizens, rather than sort of this, I think Karen Diver in one of her quotes calls it the fetishization of Indian people. And so, I don't think they have a role at all. I think the role is really incumbent on tribal nations to set their citizenship criteria the way that is right for them. I mean, it's the most sovereign right a tribal nation can have, or any nation in the world, is to identify who is a citizen. And so, sometimes that comes out in the wash. I know it's a problem, but there is no role for them.
Yeah. Somebody says, how do you know where you're really from? And the answer to the question is, where are your grandfathers buried? And that really gets you. Wow. Really gets you back down. And the first question a lot of people will ask an Indian person, who's your family? Mm-hmm. Who do you belong to? And it's intergenerational. So I think we have allies, and they have to recognize their roles as allies. And we have also frauds that we need to expose. So it's knowing our roles, and if you can't if you can't find a relative, dead or alive, you're pretty much dead in the water there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree with what you're saying, because that is what tribe are you? What family? What clan? Right?
Exactly.
And those are the questions that are asked, and it goes with our identity of who we are as tribal people. So
what's interesting, if I just can sort of go on a little bit of a tangent, the mother and daughter who wrote that chapter, the mother Becky Webster has another book coming out, hopefully in the next year or so, and she really talks about the incorporation of traditional governance into the way we govern ourselves contemporarily. And I think there's a lot of really interesting ideas in there that are related to this book and this idea of belonging and being a citizen of a nation, where what would it look like if we were to reinstitute the clan system as a way to identify who is and who isn't part of a tribal nation, and sort of extending the rafters in a way that is culturally aligned with what it means to be Oneida or whatever tribe, right?
Yeah, Becky would be a wonderful person on a podcast. She's written about corn. She's an attorney, but she's just a wonderful person. But the other thing is that because she wrote the article with her daughter, and another chapter written by Jennifer Hill Kelly with her daughter, we wanted young people to start writing and start thinking about this issue, because I'm not going to be here in 50 years, but they will be. They'll have kids and they'll have grandkids. And so right now, the conversation is about how do we make a place for them?
Yeah.
I love it. Yeah, the book we're talking about is Beyond Blood Quantum, and it's an excellent book. It's available. Tell us, it's Amazon,
Barnes and Noble, or you can write to
Birchbark Books.
Birchbark, yeah. No, and I will say this: can you put up the first book you wrote? Was it 2017? So I have not read that one, but I do want to get a copy.
Yeah, this book sold over 3,000 copies nationwide.
It's called The Great Vanishing Act. Okay.
Okay. Really a continuation of the conversation where that book was. Oh, I don't know if you can see. You can sort of see the cartoon. Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
Where that book was really sort of hard hitting in the sense that it was identifying the problem, and so this is sort of a continuation of sort of what could solutions be, and what can tribal nations do as they think about it, because as Norbert said, every tribe is sovereign and self-determined, and we're all going to come up with different answers.
So I didn't realize at the time how long community education takes. It takes really a long time. It's hard to get two Indians to agree to something because the other one just changed his mind. So if we got 17,000 members, that becomes a complicated problem. So it takes time, it takes patience, but at the same time, we're dying away. So we can't wait for 10 years for constitutional changes. Constitutional changes take a long time with any nation. So I think the Indian tribes need to figure out how to put this as a top priority, rather than slow walking this issue, because time is our enemy. Actually, along with descendants, time is our enemy. So the clock is ticking.
Yeah, and that's why I'll commit Native News Online will spend more time to this subject, because this is a problem that, as you said, time's the enemy, and the tribes have got to deal with it right now. If they haven't been, maybe kicking the can down the road, as they say, but this is something that needs to be dealt with. Hey, what are the alternatives that tribes are engaging with or coming up with to deal with this blood quantum, and saying, is it this, just descendancy, but what are some of the true alternatives that in both of your minds would really work for tribes?
What we're seeing is a number of tribes have either reduced blood quantum, say from a quarter blood to an eighth. I think Cheyenne Arapaho did that. A number of other tribes are moving away from blood quantum and using more of a lineal descendancy model. And so we're sort of seeing sort of those options being incorporated more than others. I do think there are other conversations, though, like Becky Webster is suggesting, about sort of going back to traditional government, right, and governance, and quoted in the book in one of the chapters, I can't remember which one. I think it was Lawrence Hopman's. He talks about traditional adoption. And he quotes a Crow gentleman who said, back in the old days, we didn't have any orphans. And so there were traditional ways of including people and creating, sort of connecting the dots to strengthen the nation as a whole. And so I think there are some sort of creative thinkers out there that are trying to do this community education and really sort of bringing multiple voices to the table to say, well, if this doesn't work, what might, and what might fit us culturally. Burton Warrington from Menominee is in the book, and he has a chapter called The Long Arc of Time. And he talks about language revitalization, and he says, sort of like Jill turning, the idea on the head of what if citizens are contributors rather than a drain on resources. Burton says, we're not trying to save the language is trying to save us.
I love that. Yeah, I read that.
And so what is locked in that statement about what can tribal nations do and citizens do to reclaim their government from these colonial constructs?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I know Burton. He's a very intelligent man. He interesting enough, he lives in Menominee, but he's a tribal citizen of my tribe, Prairie Band, Potawatomi. So that's where it gets confusing too.
The problem is in Oneida here, we have some Oneidas that are half Oneida and half Menominee. They're culturally Menominee, and they speak the language and participate in ceremonies, but they flip to be Oneidas for benefits, and you can only flip once. Oh. And so they're culturally Menominees, but legally they're Oneidas, and so people shop tribes sometimes. The problem is that if you go from 1/4 to 1/8 in 20 years, you're going to talk about 1/16. Then you're going to go to 120, 120. It just goes on and on. So it just kicks the can down the road. So that's not a solution.
That's very true. Hey, we already talked about a community, but how much does community really play into being truly Native American in your estimation? Can we expound on it a little more?
If I can quote you, Dad, he often talks about the need for the conversation to include sort of the reciprocal responsibilities of being a citizen to your community. And what does that mean beyond level of blood, right? Is it service? Is it language? Is there something else? But there is a responsibility. I saw a quote recently from Judge Abby Abenaki from URAC. She's the Chief Justice there, and she said, we're not rights-based, we're responsibilities-based. And so I think sort of thinking it through that lens creates a different sort of orientation of your role in that community and your responsibility to it.
So I see community as more than a place. I see community as a verb, and it has much more depth and more. It has a much more, includes tribal values, and so what we have now, because people have moved away for a variety of reasons, we have a lot of cultural orphans. And so they don't feel like they belong. They read the newsletter and they cash a per capita check, but that's the extent of their identity. So I think we have to figure out how to get them back into clans and teach them the responsibilities they have to the nation. So again, identity is a process, not an event. It's a lifelong process, So the creator never stops creating, So here we are.
No, that's true. Interesting enough, last year when we actually did 4 election polls or surveys around the presidential election, and we discovered that those natives who are off reservation, who really had not in really touch with their culture, didn't think like the people who are close to the reservations. And if I can just be blunt, those away from the reservation tend to be more Republican, and the Democrats were the ones that were really solidly behind the tribal issues, the social issues that confront us all, and say the Democrats will do a better job. And I don't want to get overly political, but it is so interesting when you talk about community and how in tune people really are with their community. Hey, is there a time we'll ever replace the word tribe with community? Like we do have some Keweenaw Bay Indian community up in Michigan. We had the Bay Mills Indian community. They're still technically tribes, but is that just
Aren't they nations?
just words or what?
Nations?
Yeah, but I try not to use the word tribe, but nation. I try not to use the word member, use the word citizens. But the Odawa tribe has an interesting take on lineal descent, and you might want to look at that. The problem with lineal descent, I think there are more Cherokees in California than there are in Tahlequah. And when you have citizens who have voting rights, and there are more living off the reservation, we got to figure out how to protect the homeland. So lineal descent might work, but you got to figure out how do you protect the headquarters, because if you don't have a homeland, you don't have a nation, and so I think that's problematic. So
yeah, there's a chapter, I think Lois Stevens' chapter in there, and she talks about the importance of place and identity, and sort of recognizing that there are a significant number of Indians who are urban or suburban or live far from the homelands, and really sort of thinking through and how do those folks have a place?
Yeah. How do we give them a reason to belong?
Yeah.
And once you have that, you can do the community education. But I think they're hungry for that. But when people move back to Oneida, nobody says welcome home. They think they're after their job or something, but and we don't have the infrastructure. So you don't have to move back to give back. The problem is that we don't have the infrastructure for housing and jobs and everything else, and people can't move back. But you got to figure out, well, if you live in Denver, you can contribute to the Indian community in Denver.
That's correct.
And you can also keep in touch with your homeland, And so we're not like salmon where you got to go back to your birthplace. We got to figure out what's the hybrid of, because the internet's going to here to stay, and for good or bad, we got to figure out how to use it.
Yes. Is there a potential consequence for moving away from blood quantum?
Well, blood quantum, I mean, the thing is for certain it's not sustainable over time. So it's a non-starter. So we got to figure out other ways in which how we identify ourselves. And every tribe has to, it's not a cookie cutter kind of solution.
Yeah, and it's building the institutions and the processes by which, if not blood quantum, what Norbert was just saying, how do you connect the dots back home, and how does the nation direct that and create a place for people no matter where they are? Not a blood quantum tribe, but an interesting example is Citizen Potawatomi Nation, whose citizens are all over the world. And they did a series of constitutional reforms, including one in 2010, where they essentially divided the map of the United States by 20,000 Citizen Potawatomi people each. And they do tribal council meetings, in a room with all these screens, so that, once you step off Potawatomi land, there is a way back home to contribute and to participate politically. And so, it's sort of a really interesting model, I think.
Yeah, it sounds pretty powerful model, actually. Yeah. Wow.
It really, I think where you got to start with tribal values and incorporate them in terms of well-being and sustainability. So I think you got to go back that, we just have a lot of cultural amnesia, and that we just need to recover. It's a part of the healing.
Yeah. And Artley Skinner's article in the book is really about building those cultural competencies, and he talks a lot about sort of the having an Indian mind, right? And
John Mohawk's book Think Indian is a good one, and how do we move forward by looking back at the same time?
Who was the elder that used to say it's the color of your heart, not the color of your skin? Was that Phil
Lane, Senior? Yeah.
Hey, I have one final question for you. Now, in John Danforth's essay, he talks about surviving as a sustained Oneida. That was his project, right? But he posed a question to some community members: what does it mean to be Oneida? So I'm going to ask each of you. I just want to hear your response. Megan, what does it mean to be Oneida to you? What does that mean?
Sure. Well, through Norbert, my dad,
Yes.
I'm actually 3 tribes. So I'm Oneida, Mohawk, and Cree. And for Oneida, I am on the first gen descendancy rolls, along with about 5,000 other people who are 1/8 blood Oneida. And so it sort of adds an interesting flow to it. But I think because of my dad and my family, I know where I come from and I know what my responsibility is. And so I think that responsibility is core to my identity.
Yeah, I like that. And Mr. Hill, what does it mean to be Oneida to you?
Well, my grandson at Christmas time, he's 6 years old, and he asked me the hardest question I've ever heard in the last 20 years. He says, "Grandpa, how come I can't be an Indian?" Well, try to explain to a 6-year-old, identity, belonging, citizenship, the IRA. You can't do it, And so, again, we got to figure out how to make a place for the future generations. And so, I love being part of a community where people recognize you as a member of that community. So it's hard. I think people have to have a touch point back to the community wherever they live, and also to be aware of what's going on. Some people ask, how long will Indians last? And they said, well, till the last song is sung. Well, if you go to powwows these days, you see a lot of people around the drum, young people. And that gives me hope that we're rebuilding community, but they don't know quite what they're doing yet, but they're learning their ways, learning the songs, learning the ceremonies. And so I think we have a chance.
Yeah. And as we were talking today, talked about sense of belonging. I know where my great grandfather, James White Pigeon, is buried in Allegan County, Michigan. That gave me a sense of belonging. And so, Miigwech to both of you. And I think we're not done with this subject. So we will, we're talking about doing some podcasting around this. And so I look forward to talking to both of you again. And so Miigwech, thank you.
Thanks so much, Levi.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope this works out well. Yeah.
Yes. And we've been talking about Beyond Blood Quantum, a book that was released in April by Megan Hill and Norbert Hill. You need to get a copy of it. It's a topic that needs to be discussed in Indian country. And Miigwech for watching, and we'll be back next week with another edition of Native Bidaské.
Thank you for joining us. If you value our warrior journalism for Indian country, please consider supporting our work by scanning the QR code or visiting the link below. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on social media, and sign up for our free daily newsletter.